now I'm going to welcome Sara Swire, who is Chief Executive of New Dawn New Day based in Braunstone.
I'm very excited because there's a lecture.
I know.
Who
needs projectors and screens,
eh?
Yeah.
I'd like to say I'm pleased to be here, but actually, given the subject matter, I'm quite sad to be here actually. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sara Swire. I've been CEO of an organisation called New Dawn New Day for the past 14 years. It used to be known as Turning Point Women's Centre. I think people might remember Turning Point Women's Centre. We were actually forced to change our name by a national charity called Turning Point, who threatened us with legal action. For some reason they saw us as a big threat to them, but now we're New Dawn New Day, and we like our new name, and we like Nina Simone. So that's me. New Dawn New Day started about 25 years ago. It actually started as a women's organisation on the Braunstone estate. We've still got a women's centre there. It actually started with a group of local women. I think there was about a dozen local women, and it was the days actually when people who were social workers used to be able to do nice things like community development work, and they ran a women's group there. And this was in the early 1980s, and the group decided that they wanted a women's centre in their area, which you can imagine, in 1981 was quite radical at the time. They found an old burnt-out shop that hadn't been occupied for a couple of years, managed to get a grant from government. The sort of mythology is that a minister came to Braunstone and they virtually kidnapped him and took him over there and made him reconsider a decision. I think it was the Department of the Environment or something in those days. And actually he did overturn the decision, which was quite remarkable. And although we've grown quite significantly over the last few years, we still have a big presence in Braunstone and maintain a lot of that sort of grassroots feel to what we do. And in the last 10 years, it's been a good time. Times have been good. We had New Deal for Communities money. We had about £50-odd million coming into the Braunstone estate, and we had some crumbs off the table of that, but enough to develop and deliver services we'd never delivered before. And in about a 10-year period, from about 2000 to 2010, our turnover grew from about £100,000 a year to just over £1 million by 2011. And we were really proud of that because actually we are quite a lean organisation. We don't have a lot of back office functions, regardless of what a lot of people seem to think us in the voluntary sector spend all our money on admin. We were delivering over £1 million worth of services. We employed 32 staff, obviously being a women's centre, the majority of those were women. And we worked actively with over 500 vulnerable families and over 900 young people in schools, actually, through one of the projects we did around teenage pregnancy. And I oversaw that development and was very proud of the work we were doing. The kind of work we did was a lot of one-to-one support for women who walk through the door with all the sort of issues that women present with. Our ethos is very much around working with the whole woman, not just the problem that walked through the door. And a lot of the women who accessed the services with us didn't access a lot of other things. Even sort of services like Sure Start, a lot of them didn't access those kind of things. We did a lot of parenting support, family learning, and we trained a lot of local residents as well to deliver those kind of services to their own communities, which was quite innovative at the time. We did a lot of work around childcare, early years, play provision for local kids. We did some work around peer mentoring to support vulnerable young parents. We trained probably about 15 young parents to provide support to other young parents. We had an education facility for young women who were in education, training or employment. And we actually had a contract managing some of the volunteer projects around the children's centres out in the county, which was good fun for a couple of years and enabled a lot of quite disadvantaged and vulnerable women to participate in the running and management of their children's centres. We've run a successful teenage pregnancy project for 10 years. It was one of the first projects we set up under the New Deal for Communities, which was started by local women. And we still train young parents to go out into local schools and talk to young people about what it's really like being a young parent so that they can make positive decisions. And we expanded that a couple of years ago to support relationships and sex education for parents, to help parents deal with some of those difficult questions. And that was again very successful. And in 2010 we got the biggest grant we'd ever had, and it was from the Ministry of Justice to deliver support services to vulnerable offenders. And that was in result of, as some of you might come across the Braunstone report, 6 tragic deaths in Style prison, prompted a review of women in the criminal justice system, and resulted in sort of quite hefty chunks of national funding coming down to local areas to look at how we can work specifically with women who have a particular set of vulnerabilities in the criminal justice system. And that service is a lot of one-to-one support, advice, counselling, psychotherapy. We work with Catherine over there because we work in partnership with Catherine's organisation, which is the Community Advice and Law Centre for Leicester, to deliver money advice and other forms of advice as well to the women there. So, what happened? Since 2010, we've seen a steady and at times quite juddering decline in our funding and support. We almost immediately lost several funding streams when the Coalition came to power that were kind of abolished overnight. Things like the Working Neighbourhoods Fund, Parenting Fund, which have been going for about 6 or 7 years, and the Future Jobs Fund. We actually had some young people who were coming to do supported employment with us. And again, they were all abolished literally overnight. And obviously we get some local funding as well. We get quite reasonably substantial fund from Leicester City Council. But again, like Tricia said, we've been part of this ongoing, what seemed like the never-ending review, which in a strange way I feel quite relieved it's finished, even though we got a letter yesterday to tell us our funding was ending for our early years service, which has been running in Braunstone for 25 years. Our after-school club has also closed. We decided to close that when we basically knew it wasn't going to survive, because we didn't want to start a new school year and build up hopes and expectations. So we ended that in the summer, but we've carried on with our early years provision. We are looking at the moment to try and fund it in a different way. There are something called nursery education grants that a lot of private nursery providers can get for 3-year-olds, so we're hoping to tap into that. But to give you an example, the funding we got from the City Council was in the region of about £75,000, and we will earn £21,000 next year, which isn't even enough to cover the salary costs of staff who will be delivering that. We have agreed, our board have agreed to subsidise that from our reserves, and we're lucky enough to have reserves. We faced closure about 5 or 6 years ago and ended up to take the City Council to the High Court and judicial review, so since then I've been doing my best to stash away as much as we possibly can to see us through some very lean times. So we're fortunate that we have that, but very, very difficult times, and it won't last forever. Adding to what Tricia said, really, in terms of the 0 to 19 review, we know funding cuts have got to be made, but it's still having a huge impact on voluntary sector providers, as well as City Council providers as well, to be fair. But it is all services around children, young people, families, communities, and it's all affecting women in quite a dramatic way. I know of at least 2 long-standing organisations that we've worked with for a very long time who are facing closure this year as a result of that particular funding stream coming to an end. Again, organisations that work with very vulnerable families. So, what is the position for the future then? Well, to be perfectly frank, from 1st of January, the only service we will have will be our work with women offenders. We're hoping to be able to continue the work with the early years service, but that will be the only service that we will be working exclusively in Braunstone. Considering where our roots come from, it feels rather tragic that we're not able to provide services directly to Braunstone anymore. I mean, we will work with women who walk through the door and need our services and referral, but we don't have the resources to be able to offer what we offered previously. And those of you who know Braunstone know that even with £50-odd million going into the community, there are still some very deeply entrenched problems and difficulties in that community. So, let's talk about women offenders. Let's talk about the Just Women project that we set up a couple of years ago. We brought this lovely grant into Leicester, £400,000. We were really excited about it. We had to go to the Ministry of Justice, have a really tough interview for it. And we were working in partnership, we still are, with the Leicestershire and Rutland Probation Trust to deliver that. In the second year, we had a grant of £210,000 and worked with 120 women. In year 2, There was a lot of shenanigans around who was going to fund this in year 2, but the Ministry of Justice said, well, we will part fund it, and thankfully a coalition of charitable trusts got come together under the agenda and agreed to match fund what the Ministry of Justice were putting in, but it still resulted in a funding cut. We got £105,000 from the Ministry of Justice, and we got £80,000 from Paul Getty Junior Charitable Trust for 1 year. This was. Thankfully, the following year we had £185,000 again, but again, as we all know, a standstill budget is a funding cut. But we were just relieved to get funding at the level we did. This year, we've received a letter saying that the funding that they're allocating for this year is going to be the same as last year, so we're all very excited about that. And then 3 pages into the letter, they tell us that they want to actually spread it a lot thinner and spread it among a larger proportion of probation trusts, some of who don't have women-specific work. So, in principle, it's great that they want to do this in terms of, you know, enhancing the service for women across the country, but they are doing it at the expense of existing services for women up and down the country. And I got an email the other day asking whether we would be willing to deliver the service for 2/3 of what we get at the moment at the same level. And you can imagine what the answer to that will be. So it's tough times, really. I mean, we're hoping to negotiate a better settlement than that because we want to continue with the work. The work is making massive differences to some of the most vulnerable women you'll ever meet. But if a funding cut is implemented, it could result in a 45% drop in services. We're talking about working with 120 women year 1, we're talking about 90 women year 2, we're talking potentially 45 women next year. You know, we are still having to go back and declare our value for money. You know, we know what we're doing changes lives. We know that it reduces women's reoffending. We've done a lot of work on this. We know it gets them off drugs and alcohol. We know it gets them out of abusive relationships. We know it reduces poverty through the financial advice and other forms of advice that they get. It reduces their homelessness. It keeps mothers out of prison and it keeps children out of care. Last year alone, 17 children were taken out of the care system and returned to their families as a result of the work that we do. We know. Can you imagine, never mind the social and emotional and psychological costs of that, what the actual financial costs of those kind of interventions are, and yet still we get letters saying we need to provide value for money. We did a social return on investment analysis, which is quite an interesting thing. You look at how, every pound that goes into a service like this, how much sort of social benefit you receive, and how much it saves the taxpayer's purse, basically. And just the initial analysis we did over a 9-month period, which is really short, it showed a 350% return on that. And we were just looking at health and well-being outcomes, never mind the cost of sending a woman to prison. So it's quite shocking. And in fact, actually, if you want to look at how much public services that are delivered by the statutory sector cost, check out a document called, I think it's Health and Social Care Analysis. Google it. I found it through Googling it. It's quite amazing, actually. Do you know it costs something like £36 to see your GP for 12 minutes? It has all those sort of things, and it's a very interesting document. £110 for an hour's worth of cognitive behavioural therapy. It's all costed out. It's really quite interesting. But yes, we're still being asked for our service to provide value for money. The service costs less than £2,000 per woman. Again, the needs of those women are huge. They're some of the most vulnerable women you're ever likely to meet. I've worked with disadvantaged, worked in Turning Point during the day. For 14 years before that, I worked in homelessness and housing advice, and they are some of the most vulnerable women I've ever come across. Over 95% of them have experienced some kind of childhood abuse, trauma, sometimes multiple abuse, and it is quite shocking. And obviously that ends up with things like severe injury, mental health problems, drug and alcohol abuse, all those kind of things. One of the interesting things about this cut at the moment that I'm sort of mulling over in my mind really is the fact that they're proposing something like a 33-35% cut to funding to the women's services. I spoke to the chair of the Probation Trust last Thursday and asked, like, what is the general funding cut here? And she said that they're facing a cut of about 5 to 10%, which is, it's a huge cut to something like the probation service, and we should all be worried when the probation service lose their funding. But actually 90 to 95% of the people who use the probation service are men, and the cuts to the women's service is looking at around 35%. So at the moment I'm looking to see whether there's any mileage in exploring using things like public law, equality and duty to try and challenge those kind of decisions. But again, it isn't easy. So what are we trying to do to protect women from the cuts? It's walking up a very steep hill, I think. The doors of our Women's Centre in Braunstone will remain open because we owned that building. We bought it with lottery cash before my time even, so we're really pleased that no one's going to be in a position to take that away from us. We have, like I said, a number of reserves that can kind of top us up for a couple of years, but I don't think this is going to go away. You know, we are not waiting for suddenly things to get better. We're planning for things to get worse, actually, like a lot of other organisations. But we're looking at ways of trying to generate income. We're trying to sort of like develop new partnerships and fundraising. We had some transition funding last year, which is kind of the government's sort of like, there you go, there's a bit of money and learn how to manage without finances. And we entertained thought of looking for some philanthropic funding, and we had some remarkable statistic about donkey sanctuaries and women's refuges, and there's more money that goes to one donkey sanctuary in Essex than goes to the whole of the women's refuges in Britain. So we're not very attractive for philanthropic giving, sadly. But thinking back to Braunstone, you know, like I said before, even with NDC money, you know, it's a hard community to live in. The levels of poverty are very high. There's a 6-year life expectancy difference between people who live in Braunstone and people who live in the most affluent area of Leicester. I don't know whether you know this, but as you go down the A47 from Sara to Braunstone, for every year, for every mile you travel, life expectancy goes down a year. And of course, Braunstone's right on the edge. You go over the edge of Braunstone, it goes back up another 6 years, which is fascinating. Still very high numbers of unemployment, single parents, teenage mothers, and I think this is the bit that makes me so shocked. We actually have a local food share scheme there, which is basically giving away food to people, handouts, food handouts. 140 families we've got registered on that at the moment, and what year are we in? I don't have to make the case to you guys about why we need to fund women's services. You know, they're the backbone of society, really. We know they spend the majority of their income on their family. We know that they're more likely to be carers of children and people with disabilities and older people. And they're the ones most likely to act on the health needs of their families and those kind of things. You know, we need them to be well. We need people to be able, we need women to be able to do what women do best, because actually as a society we're going to really suffer if they can't do that. And you know, in 1997 we actually sort of like thought about things getting better, but things can only get worse now. And I'm usually quite an optimistic soul, and this is why I don't like standing here saying this. But it's I'm really struggling to think about how we're going to find our way through this. I've spoken at length about the impact of funding cuts on one small women's organisation in one relatively small city in England. This is going on up and down the country, and all over the country. You know, women and the services they rely on are being hammered, not only through the funding cuts, but also things like the welfare benefits and stuff that Tricia talked about. I'm going to leave that bit because that was all the stuff that you talked about, Tricia. So leave that one. But I'd like to end with one thought, actually. This was a letter I read in a newspaper a little while ago, which kind of summed it up to me. You know when you read one of these letters and then you send it off the email to everybody, going, look at this. And I'll read it out to you. And it says, all major parties have been peddling the line that between 2010 and 2015 we must see the largest ever cut in public spending since 1976-1980 period. I don't know whether anybody saw it, today's Guardian. There was a graph in it about, you know, Britain's public spending commitments, and it actually goes lower than America by something like 2017, which obviously America is the shining example of public services for the world, aren't they? Those who say this should take a look at this year's Sunday Times rich list. It exposes the fact that the combined wealth of the richest 1,000 residents of the UK now stands at £414 billion, an increase of a staggering 62% since 2009. So let's have no more talk from the politicians of all mainstream parties about the necessity of savage spending cuts. The money for the things that the vast majority of the population need, such as housing, health, education and jobs, is in the grotesquely inflated pockets of the mega-rich. It's time for them to cough up, and let's have no more witless talk about how we're all in this together. I thought that kind of summed up how I felt, so I'll leave you with that, and obviously all joining the debate. It's quite good later to think about that in the back of your mind. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm absolutely flabbergasted at that figure. 414 billion.
Yes.
Quite
They
astounding.
could pay off the debt and still have change.
Indeed, indeed.
1,000 people.